Today on the Locked On NBA podcast, Dante Devincenzo keeps it spicy in the Garden. Joel Embiid, we get an injury update from the 76ers. Plus, is this Luka Doncic's MVP to lose? That's all ahead. Stay with us. Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On NBA. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On NBA is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. I'm Doug Branson, host of the Locked On Hornets podcast, and your shot clock Sherpa as we whip around the Locked On NBA Podcast Network of NBA podcasts, breaking down the biggest NBA stories from our local experts. I'm joined by two of Locked On's premier national NBA experts from the Locked On Nuggets podcast and the Action Network, Matt Moore. Matt, what did you see in the association this weekend that interested you?
The Detroit Pistons continue to look like they actually have an idea what they're doing on offense, which is a cool sign. The Warriors are back to playing elite defense. I am concerned that the Celtics are just going to house every team that they face from now on by 30 points. And boy, the Nuggets bench is really, really bad.
All right, we're going to talk about those Pistons coming up later in the show. From the Locked On Bulls podcast, we've got Haize. Haize, what did you see in the association this weekend?
The Knicks and the Wolves got a little fiery this past weekend, man. I really enjoyed that. That's probably the most fun I've had watching a preseason game all year so far.
Yeah, it was way too spicy for the preseason. This is preseason. We got to set some boundaries here. Let's not get too hot before the regular season. We're going to get to that in just a moment. A lot happened in the NBA this weekend. We had a Joel Embiid injury update. It has Sixers fans a little bit confused about the future. Cade Cunningham has Pistons fans dreaming about a playoff future. And is an MVP award finally in Luka Doncic's future? All that ahead. First, we go to the Garden, where the Knicks and Wolves didn't have to wait very long at all for a post-Cat Randall swap matchup. But it wasn't either of those players that made headlines. Julius Randle didn't play at all. It was Dante Devincenzo, who was also moved in the deal. He was exchanging words with New York's bench during free throw attempts and after the game with Knicks assistant Rick Brunson. During the free throw attempts, he appeared to yell at Brunson, "This is what happens when they let you run the show." There's a lot to parse here. Let's send it first to Locked On Knicks host Gavin Shaw with his take on what got Dante Devincenzo extra spicy.
Maybe there is a little bit of bad blood over what Dante's role was going to be on the Knicks, and that like he clearly and fairly felt like underestimated and underappreciated after, again, what was an incredible season where for at least short stretches, like he was the Knicks' number one option, and then he was going to be banished to the bench and then was ultimately traded. Like, I understand why there was some anger there.
Okay, so he understands why there's anger there. Haize, do you understand why there's anger there? Was Dante inbounds or out of bounds for mixing it up with the Knicks bench and Rick Brunson? You get the first word.
Listen, this is part of basketball. Maybe it's just me and my old school nature. Like, I love this aspect of basketball. Like, it's all within the nature of being competitive. There's nothing disrespectful said or anything like that. I think that we need to get back to more like this. And if this builds some type of actual rivalry with Eastern Conference and the Western Conference team who won't play each other a lot, I'm not mad at it. I've seen like really weird reactions to this. I personally enjoy this aspect of basketball. And let's get back. Let's do this more often.
I mean, what's funny, though, is like, I don't think this was about basketball. I think it was about business. You know, like I've heard from people around the league that have kind of said that Dante wasn't thrilled with how his role got diminished despite how well he played last year. I think he was frustrated with the whole organization and with, Brunson obviously having a big role with the team in part because, his son is the franchise MVP candidate point guard. It causes, I think, a lot of tension there. So I think that there's a lot more under the surface here. And that, I think, is different from the basketball side. I love them going at each other. I love them being competitive. I love seeing that competitive fire, but it is kind of funny to see some of this backstage stuff spill out over the screen.
Oh, well, so how much of this is smoke and fire when it comes to Rick Brunson? Like, is Dante uncovering a conspiracy theory here? Is Rick Brunson shadow GMing the Knicks?
No, that's CAA. It's always been CAA. It's always going to be CAA. There's a shadow organization with the Knicks, but it's not Rick Brunson. He's just a member of the cabal. But look, like that's a lot of the whole thing, right? Is like the NBA is so much more political than people realize, and there's so much more that goes on under the surface in terms of agents and politics and all of that stuff. And that to me was what this kind of showed, is like a little bit behind the scenes of how that could spill out on the page when a guy feels slighted by an organization and his chance to make more money.
I completely agree with Matt Moore on that one. I like it's yeah, there's things outside of basketball that play a part into this. And I don't think the thing between Rick Brunson and Dante, like they said afterwards, somebody said that they're basically family. They're going to talk crap to each other. It is what it is.
Well, does this have the potential to be one of the budding rivalries in the NBA? I mean, we get this, we get a little bit of sauce here in the first preseason game. They'll have some matchups coming up in the regular season, and both of these teams do to be contenders in their respective conferences. Do you think this could be one of the better rivalries in the NBA this season? Haize.
Absolutely. I think it's two games that play against each other, right? Like his East Conference and Western Conference teams. And like I said, bring the rivalry back. Bring them back. I'm not mad at this at all. Like at the end of the day, I do think that because there is something personal involved in this. Like Dante Devincenzo feels personally slighted, and cool, great. Go out there and perform great when you play against the Knicks. That gives you a little bit of extra sauce when you play the Knicks, and your team picks up on that energy and fights with you. So be it. As long as it's all within, it doesn't extend outside of the game of basketball as far as like physicality or anything like that. I'm all fine with this. I love this.
I think what's going to be great is going to be seeing those games, and that you got so much history. Cat going against Minnesota, who he feels shocked by. Julius Randle, who was frustrated so many times with how New York treated him. Donte now in this kind of position. And then you add fuel to the fire, which is Ant's always ready to start trouble. That guy is always ready at the drop of a hat to get wild. So I'm going to be excited for those games. Those games are going to be two title contenders. And yeah, now there's something extra. And I agree, we need more of this in the NBA and less buddy stuff.
All right. Coming up on the Locked On NBA podcast, the Sixers release an update on Joel Embiid's recovery, but no one seems to feel any better about it. We'll have more. Stay with us. Locked On NBA. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. And we've been doing a lot of talk about the preseason, the NBA preseason, here on Locked On NBA, but you can already place your bets on the opening night matchups for the regular season, including on the two teams that we talked about just a second ago. The New York Knicks getting 5 points in their opening matchup against the Boston Celtics, the Minnesota Timberwolves favorites at -2.5 against the Los Angeles Lakers. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Thanks for making Locked On NBA your first listen every day. The 76ers announced that Joel Embiid will sit out the remainder of the preseason as Embiid and team doctors work to manage a left knee injury that cost him all but 39 games last season. Here's Locked On 76ers host and Sixers beat writer Keith Pompey on the level of concern in Philly.
When do you hit the panic button, right? Well, if he's not practicing by October the 20th, well, October the 20th is when they're going to have their thing, the blue-white scrimmage. So if he's not practicing by October the 21st, right, then you really have a problem.
Okay, Matt, do they really have a problem? Should the Sixers be panicking over this latest development? Should Sixers fans be panicking?
I don't think so, just from the perspective of, look, it can always get worse for Philly fans, but we know this is going to be inconsistent. He can practice in that blue-white scrimmage. He can play on opening night. And if you ask me, is he going to play 2 weeks later? I don't know. I just don't know. And that's how it's going to be with Joel. They need to try and keep him healthy for the playoffs. They said they were going to do that last year. I think he pushed too hard early season. You can't really know. You're just going to have to get to April and be like, hey, he's healthy. We might actually have a shot. That's all you can really do at this point, is hope with Embiid, is be happy when he's able to play, accept that he's not going to be able to play often. And then that's all you can really go through because of how inconsistent it's been and how frustrating it's been for everyone, including Embiid, for him trying to get healthy.
No, I agree. There's no point in panicking over this because the 76ers prepared for this. This is why they built this team this offseason the way that they did. So they're better. They have a better ability to withstand if Joel Embiid is going to miss some time. Now, the key thing in this is if Joel Embiid is going to be healthy by the playoffs, not necessarily at the start of the season. That's the most important thing for this Philadelphia 76ers team, in my opinion. Can Embiid be healthy by the playoffs? And if he is, then you're good to go. Now, I don't know how far they're going to go, but I mean, you're good to go overall. I think this team has more than enough to be able to still stay competitive enough if Joel Embiid isn't healthy at the start of the season.
But is there anything to a little bit of the mystery around this, that he's not playing preseason, that he played in the Olympics? There seems to be some just under the surface frustration among some fans, saying what's going on here? Is the team being forthright? Is Embiid being forthright with his recovery efforts? Any smoke to that, Matt?
I mean, is the team being honest? No, they're never honest. They've never been honest about him. I mean, look, every single night, if you track it, it's like Embiid's probable to play. And then like, oh, no, he's out. He's one of the only guys that can go from probable to out. You never see that. Every game he's day to day. Like, they're never going to be transparent with these injuries. Most teams aren't, the Sixers especially. It will be a question mark every single night of the season, whether he's going to play or not. There were games where he said he was absolutely going to, and he tried to, and he couldn't make it. This is just the reality of where they're at with Embiid. He is always going to be a game time decision given his injury history.
Okay, here's my next question off of this. Do you believe, Haize, that Joel Embiid can be the same player after these two injuries? Are we going to say we get a fully healthy Joel Embiid either to start the season or at some point quickly after the start of the season? Are we going to see the same player?
I think so. I think that Joel Embiid, even when you look at what he did in some of those performances in the playoffs, with what he was going through, I think that Joel Embiid can still be Joel Embiid. I think the key thing is that he just, when he's healthy, yeah, there's going to be some times where he may have to sit a quarter or so or whatever, but I don't have any doubt personally until I see otherwise that Joel Embiid is going to be able to be Joel Embiid when he's on the court. And that's what the surface is.
I think it's a great point by Haize there about how effective he was in those playoff series, because he was. And part of this is the team was built around him. You have to account for Embiid if he's on the floor. And as Haize kind of mentioned, where the surrounding cast is better, even if he's on the floor and he's not 100%, those other guys are still built to take advantage of the attention that he draws. So I think it's a great point by Haize. I think they're better built now to be able to hold him up if he's not 100%, while him also making an impact just by being out there.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Paul George in just a moment. One more question on Embiid, though. Are you buying the weight loss storyline that goes along with this, that he's dropped 20 to 25 pounds? Preseason is all about Weight Watchers. And so I'm always curious if you buy these kinds of things and the impact of losing that weight on Joel Embiid's ability to be healthy. Haize, are you buying that?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, I remember the year that LeBron, quote unquote, everybody was making a big deal about him losing a lot of weight, and then he had it all back on by December. So it's just like, it is what it is when it comes down to. I think the key thing is he healthy, and has he lost any mobility? How much mobility has he gained? Now, if losing weight helps him with taking some pressure off those knees for the long term, that's great. But, at the end of the day, we've seen Joel Embiid be 280 pounds and put up almost 200 points in 5 postseason games. I feel, regardless of the weight, I have a lot of faith in Joel Embiid and how he can perform.
Yeah, I just think if you kind of look at it, he's one of those guys that draws fouls in part by hitting the floor, because that's easier on the body in terms of the contact and all those types of things. If he's lighter, that's less weight hitting the floor. So that's probably an addition where I would be like, okay, that makes a little bit more sense, because it never makes logical sense to me of like, man, you're hitting the floor a lot. Like, I'm worried about you getting banged up. But if he's lighter, maybe that makes it easier for those kind of sequences, since drawing fouls is a huge part of his game and the advantage that he's able to get. So I think it could help, but I also think it's, again, so much of this stuff is kind of random twists of fate that you just kind of have to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, and it's one thing to lose weight as you're ramping up for the season. If you do have to miss games, I mean, I think that's been the tougher part for NBA players, is when they go through injuries. Keeping for guys that have had weight issues, like keeping that weight off is really the challenge. We'll see there. I want to stay with the 76ers. Paul George made his much anticipated preseason debut for his new team over the weekend. George scored a team high 23 points in 26 minutes and added 6 rebounds and 2 assists. Here's Kayla Santiago from the Locked On 76ers podcast on how George meshed with his new teammates on the floor.
I think it's a fantastic fit right now for the Philadelphia 76ers, especially if the big fella can't play early on in the season. So you're going to need a second big point scorer, and that's going to be Paul George for you. I liked the addition with him and Tyrese Maxey out there on the floor. It's been really fun to see what he can do here, Keith. And I think when you look at this matchup right now, we've seen a lot of players, the second, third stars for Philadelphia, take games like these off. Paul George saying, nah, I'm going to go out there. I'm going to do everything that I need to do so this team knows what to expect from me.
So Kayla impressed with the start. And as she said there, Paul George makes a ton of sense when you think about him stepping up in the absence of an injured Joel Embiid. And Haize, you mentioned, the construction of this team is somewhat built around that possibility with the addition of George. But what if Embiid is serious about being healthy for the playoffs and that actually happens? Is an Embiid, George, Maxey a tight fit, or is it a disaster waiting to happen, Matt?
I think it's a really good fit with Embiid there. I understand that Kayla's impressed and she does a great job. One of the things I talked to PG a couple of years ago when he was in OKC for an interview, talking to him about kind of how he adapts to the game. PG's not a guy that like every night is going to be aggressive. He lets the game come to him. If the defense is adapting to Maxey, he'll fill those gaps. When that defense shifts to him, he'll defer a little bit more. So maybe that balance is better than it was with Tobias Harris, low bar. But I just think that there's going to have to be a little bit of managing expectations. PG is not going to be like, yeah, I'm going for 30 every single night. I do like the fit, though. When you have Embiid and Maxey, now it's like, all right, they're really focusing on two-man game with Embiid and Maxey. That opens the door for Paul to fit in and do what he does. The defense has to adapt and account for Paul. Guess what? That's going to open up for Maxey and Embiid to get going. So that balance, I think, is what makes PG a really good fit on this team, is he is willing to be malleable around what the team needs and who's got to go in that night.
And I completely agree with that. I think Paul George and his willingness to fit into a role here, especially when needed, it could be the thing that takes this team off the top, right? The sum of the parts all together. I love how Matt just laid out about how they can all fit together, because I 100% agree with that. I think Paul George has an ability to do just about anything the 76ers team calls on him to do, and him letting the game come to him is probably the best thing. Yeah, he's going to be better off in that Tobias Harris role, but he also has the ability to do more when he's called on to do more. And there are going to be games where they need Paul George to be old school Paul George. And I think he still has a lot of that in him, and he's going to be able to pace himself a lot better over the course of this season as well.
Is there a scenario in your mind where this doesn't work? And where does that crack show up? Does it show up from Embiid's perspective, or and I think both of you are in the mindset of Paul George being sort of and this is I think an overused term when it comes to Paul George, but Swiss Army knife. You can use him in any way you want to, and he allows himself to be used in those kind of ways because he is focused on team success. But if this were to go wrong, where do you think those cracks start to show up? Haize?
If I'm talking about where the cracks show up, I'm more so worried about the health aspect of it, because while Paul George did play 74 games last season, which is great, we're talking about the previous 4 years before that he didn't play over 60 games, and 2 of those years he didn't play over 50. So that's where I'm more worried about, with already having the injury concern that you have with Joel Embiid. And yes, in a perfect world, this team is better built to withstand injuries to Joel Embiid. What if you have a time period where Joel and Paul George are both out for an extended period of time? That's where those cracks start to show for me. That's where my biggest concern would be at for this team.
Yeah, I mean, beyond the injury side, because PG is older, like Haize said, I think that one of where I do kind of a little bit flinch is maybe on the spacing side of things. They lose Nicholas Batum, who is such a great floor spacer as well as being versatile. They're going to be more dependent on kind of this stricter structure and working around these guys. Tyrese has gotten used to being an on-ball guy. Like, he's the primary creator and he's ready to be in his prime. And like I said, Paul's willing to kind of defer a little bit, but do you want Paul George as a pure spot-up shooter in some of these sets? Do you have enough? Can Kelly Oubre fill that gap? I thought Embiid really leveled up as a passer last season with Nick Nurse giving him more mechanisms for him to work out of the high triple threat option. He was really good in those kind of situations. You don't have as many cutters on this team, and that's just part of having Paul George, who does need the ball in his hands. So I wouldn't be surprised, especially early on with new personnel, if things are a little clunky and it takes them some time, even with Daryl Morey's very Daryl Morey-isms about the offense. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes a little while for everything to get straightened out with the overall structure of the offense.
All right, coming up next on the Locked On NBA podcast, we move to the Dallas Mavericks. Luka Doncic, is it finally his turn to win MVP? I will give you the FanDuel odds on MVP, and we will discuss coming up. Thanks again for making Locked On NBA your first listen every day. Paul George, not the only one to debut for his new team over the weekend. We also had Klay Thompson scoring 10 points for the Mavs on Friday. The Mavericks giving Doncic another weapon in the quest to avenge a finals loss. But will it be enough to help him get his first MVP award? That was the discussion on Locked On Mavs this morning. Here's Isaac Harris.
I think this is the best shot he has at winning the MVP going into a season. One of the biggest things about winning MVP is obviously narrative. And because we know he's going to get the stats, we know the Mavericks are going to win a ton of games, even though they need to finish there in that top 4, especially. But if they could finish, 1 or 2, that would be amazing for his MVP odds.
Okay, so here are the MVP odds from a FanDuel Sportsbook. They have Luka leading at plus 380 in front of Nikola Jokic at 480 and SGA at plus 500. So, Matt, I'll toss it to you. Is this Luka's to lose?
I think so. I think he should be the favorite. I've got a ticket on him. I don't think that there's as many people in this race as the odds are going to imply. If you look at the history of this award, once you hit 29, we have very few winners over the age of 29 in the last 30 years. I think the list is something like 2. It just doesn't happen. You have to be kind of in that prime going for it because most guys shift to postseason success. Luka's going to have the numbers. He's a one-man army, as Nikola Jokic said last year. He's going to do all that. I have the Mavs at 55 wins this season. I think they're going to be an absolute wagon. I will just kind of twist this around and say, is this Luka's to lose? It better be. Like, he better win MVP because as much hype has been given him over and over and over again, he's got the team around him. He puts up all the numbers, got to come through with the wins. He better win MVP this season.
And I think one of the bigger questions around Luka Doncic has always been like, how is he going to be able to sacrifice enough with other players around him to be able to win? And Luka showed that he sacrificed some, but he was still able to very much so be Luka Doncic. And so the narrative aspect, I do think he has that in his favor. The redemption arc of losing in the NBA Finals, adding Klay Thompson to this team is going to add a lot of new eyes and things to this team as well. And everybody's looking to see, can they do it this year? Last year, a lot of people were tuned in asking, can him and Kyrie work it out? And they did. And you had really great role players step up big time for them down the stretch of that season, but it was still all on Luka Doncic. Luka Doncic has the skill to be in the MVP conversation every single year. That goes without saying. He's going to be in top 10 in scoring, top 10 in rebounds, top 10 in assists. He's going to do that every single year. And I agree with Matt. This better be the year that Luka Doncic wins the MVP. It's all set up for him.
It's just so interesting though, because like when you look at his stats across the board, he's improved his 3-point shooting year over year. There's so many aspects of his game that he's improved, and then the team got to the finals. Of course, they lost the finals, so there is a level, winning the finals. There's a level to get to there, but just like what's going to be the factor? Is it narrative? Is there something within his game that within the stats or whatever that he could change to make a stronger case?
I mean, look, I'll say this. One of the things that's been talked about on all like the nerd shows has been the impact's not there. They don't win by a ton with him on the floor. Like if you talk about plus minus or adjusted plus minus or net rating, people kind of their eyes glaze over. How much do you win by when you're on the court? And he has not won by as much as his contemporaries. He doesn't match up with Jokic or Giannis or Embiid in these categories. That's what he's got to get to. Like he needs to win those minutes. They need to be awesome when he's on the floor. And they've got the ability to do that this season. I think Derek Lively is actually a bigger factor than Kyrie in that. He is the perfect weapon next to Luka. But like that's going to have to be it's not about like how many dimes you throw or how many points you score or even how well you shoot. You have to win your minutes, man. You got to do what your team needs for you to win your minutes. That's what's going to get him the MVP.
I completely agree with you there.
All right, so who is his biggest competition? Because according to the Locked On Mavericks podcast, they both felt like SGA was going to be the biggest barrier between Luka Doncic and finally getting his MVP. Haize, do you agree? Is SGA his biggest competition, or is there another name that you have?
120% agree that SGA is his biggest competition. I think that he should be his biggest competition. You look at what SGA has been able to do the last couple of years from a statistic standpoint, and then I also think like this team in adding Isaiah Hartenstein, adding Alex Caruso to the team, added 2 players that I could wax poetic about the OKC Thunder all day. I can go down the path of that, but I have talked about SGA as being an MVP candidate for probably the last 2 years, and I do think that the team is going to have the success. He's going to have the individual stats to get in. And I do think that coming into the season, at least, he should be the other favorite to try to keep Luka Doncic from winning the MVP.
I mean, the problem here is like the biggest threat to him is something that we can't see right now from where we're at, because just like Haize said, look, the Thunder should be just a destroyer of worlds. Like they should just be absolutely rolling. They're the favorite to get the number 1 seed in the West. They have the second highest win total behind the Celtics. They're expected to be the 1 seed. They have this upgraded roster, didn't lose anybody huge, didn't have to give up anything. They should be absolutely awesome. But what if they're not? And the question is like, all right, who fills that kind of gap? If the Cavs make a huge jump, is it Donovan Mitchell, who I think has put up some great numbers and has been better, I think, than the reputation on him? If the Suns make a big jump this year, does Kevin Durant or Devin Booker get in that conversation, or do they eat too much of one another's vote total? If you look at if there's another surprise team, if the Warriors suddenly come out and are cruising towards a 50-plus number, does that get Steph in the conversation? And especially, you want to talk about narrative, if the Lakers are good, with how freaking good LeBron was last year, how many voters are going to be like, ooh, let's give him one on the way out? There are threats, I think, but I do think the top needs to be Luka and Shea from where we're at right now.
All right, finally, our final topic here. Unless you're in Detroit, you won't be blamed for not paying close attention to the Pistons this preseason, but Cade Cunningham, it looks like he's already in midseason form, finishing with a near 25-point triple-double and win over the Suns over the weekend. Caveat, okay, it's preseason, but what's gotten into Cade? Here's Locked On Pistons host Kuka Hill with the answer.
If you were concerned about Cade, are you concerned about him now? Like, no. There was no reason to ever be concerned about Cade. He actually started taking middies this game. He actually started being aggressive this game. I'm paying attention to small details. Is he doing rip-throughs? Is he using floaters? Is he taking pull-up threes? Is he doing stuff like that he didn't do this past year that he can add to this upcoming year? Those are three small details I really like seeing from Cade, and I hope you see a lot of this upcoming year, because if he does it, I think that will translate to a really successful season for Cade Cunningham.
So Cade trying to pull the Pistons out of irrelevancy, he's going to need some help to do that. This has me less thinking, though, about Cade Cunningham and what it means for the Pistons, and more about Cade's 2021 draft class, because you've got Cade, number 1 overall, Jalen Green, and then Evan Mobley, all guys who don't have an all-star bid under their belt yet. And so I'm curious, Haize, who's going to get that first all-star bid? Who's going to make that fourth-year leap?
It should be Cade Cunningham. I think that goes without saying. It should be Cade Cunningham. Now, Evan Mobley's also set up. I think I think the world of Evan Mobley, and he's a great player. But I look at just how that shot distribution and everything works. Now, he can very well hit a leap that can change that. But I think the dynamic of that team, I trust Cade more to make that leap, because it's all built around Cade and what he's able to do as a scorer, as a point guard for that Detroit Pistons team. And while I still don't have a lot of faith in the Pistons' ability to win a lot of games this season, I do think as long as Cade Cunningham is healthy, we're going to see a big leap from Cade this year, because this is one of the first years as well that he's able to come out and just focus on working out his game. He wasn't really rehabbing anything serious. He's just been able to focus this offseason on rounding out and adding to his game.
Yeah, I mean, I think Cade's got the best opportunity. He's just got the worst team of the three. And like, that's the problem. But we have seen all-stars selected from a lot of bad teams. Like, we've just seen that pretty consistently, that if you're exceptional, you'll get rewarded by the voters, the fans, and the voting process. So I agree. Like, look, I think the Pistons are going to be decent this year. Now, there is some dispute, and people I've talked to around the league about whether they want to be good this year or not. And that obviously kind of makes you pump fake. But honestly, with Tobias Harris, and Malik Beasley on the floor, they actually have NBA quality guys. I heard Paul Reed's been awesome, so the team's like a little bit better, and that's honestly enough with where Cade got to. Cade was great the last half of last year. Jalen Green, I think, has an excellent opportunity, but he's never been able to cash in on it. With Mobley, players of his type were dominant defensive players. He had a 3 last year. He doesn't have the profile of who gets into All-Star. He seems more like, hey, he might wind up being the most impactful guy and the guy that wins the most in his career, but I still don't know where he fits in that Cavs offense. So between the three of them, I'm with Haize. I got to go with Cade.
It'll be an uphill battle, but with Evan, it's I think he's like top of my list, and like, wow, man, what's been the issue with him and breaking through and being able to make that case. Haize, what do you think about that? About what Matt said there about Evan Mobley and him being the type of player that may never sort of break whatever that wall is to break through that all-star wall?
Yeah, I mean, I could see that happen. I don't. It's hard to diagnose with the current makeup of that Cleveland Cavaliers team. I think that's the biggest hurdle there. And they've locked in that core completely. That doesn't mean they can't move on from them, but I just think with just the balance and the dynamic of how they run that offense, how they use Evan Mobley, I just don't see it happening for him anytime soon. And unless they kind of shift and do more through Evan, I don't know if he does break through that anytime soon.
There was a really good conversation on Locked On Cavs about comparing Mobley to Chris Bosh, which I thought was really interesting. And part of that was that when Bosh was in Toronto, like he was really the center point of the offense, and the guards' job were to get him involved. Next to Allen, that's not the case. Like the easiest, most effective tactic available for the Cavs is, hey, let's run high pick and roll with Jared Allen and Donovan Mitchell and space the floor around them. And that's why Mobley taking a 3-point jump helped them last year. But if you want to maximize Mobley and kind of get him more involved, get him to open up that game, he's got to be more involved in those kind of situations. I think that's tough with the spacing. It's one of the reasons why everyone continues to wonder if Jared Allen's going to be there long term.
All right, subscribe to the Locked On NBA podcast on YouTube and leave us a comment. Let us know what you think about all of these topics that we talked about today. Great show. Thank you to Matt Moore. Thank you to Haize. If you like what you heard today, make sure you're subscribed to Locked On NBA, not only on YouTube, but wherever you get podcasts. Thanks for making Locked On NBA your first listen. Now for your second listen, find Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Become a fantasy basketball expert and get the edge over your league mates with daily tips from Josh Lloyd. Find Locked On Fantasy Basketball on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Enjoy tonight's action. Be kind to each other. We'll see you next time on Locked On NBA.